I was 74 years old when I realized I had become invisible in my own home, not in a dramatic way. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no raised voices. Invisibility doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, the way dust settles on furniture you no longer use. It began the winter after my husband died. Arthur had been gone 6 months when my son suggested we simplify things. He said it kindly, standing in the kitchen where I had cooked every meal for 42 years. The kettle was whistling, snow pressed against the windows like folded paper. "You don't need to worry about the paperwork anymore, Mom," he said. "Let me handle it." I remember smiling. I remember feeling relieved. When you've lived long enough, relief feels like rest. And I was tired of forms and signatures and phone calls that always ended with "I'm sorry for your loss." So I agreed. I didn't know that was the moment my name began to disappear. Arthur and I had built our life slowly. We weren't wealthy in the way people imagine wealth. No yachts, no vacation homes, but we were careful. We saved, we planned. We paid for things outright when we could. The house was ours, paid in full 20 years before his heart finally gave out. I had worked as a school secretary for most of my adult life. Arthur ran a small electrical supply business. Together, we learned how to stretch a dollar without feeling stretched thin. When he died, people told me I was lucky. "At least you're comfortable," they said. "At least you won't have to worry." They meant well. What they didn't understand was that comfort attracts attention. A few weeks after I agreed to simplify, my daughter-in-law began stopping by more often. She brought groceries I hadn't asked for. She reorganized cabinets that didn't need reorganizing. She smiled too much and asked too many questions. "Do you know where Arthur kept the old files?" she asked one afternoon, wiping her hands on a dish towel that used to belong to my mother. "I'm not sure," I said truthfully. "Why?" "Oh, just curious." Curiosity, I would later learn, is a polite word for inventory. At first, nothing changed on the surface. Meals were shared, holidays observed. My grandson hugged me when he left for school. Life went on, but beneath it, small things began to shift. The mail arrived already opened. My phone rang less often. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. I told myself I was imagining it. At 74, people expect you to imagine things. They speak slowly to you loudly as if volume can replace respect. They assume confusion before competence, so I stayed quiet. Then one morning, my debit card declined at the pharmacy. It was embarrassing more than alarming. A line had formed behind me. The cashier whispered as if whispering could soften the moment. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It says insufficient access." Insufficient access. I drove home carefully, my hands steady on the wheel. I had lived through wars, recessions, births, deaths. I did not panic easily. When I asked my son, he sighed. "Oh, that," he said. "We move some things around, just temporary. It's easier if everything's centralized." Centralized, that word again, efficiency, centralization, simplification, words people use when they don't want to explain. I nodded, I trusted him. Or maybe I trusted the version of him I had raised. That night I lay awake listening to the house breathe. Old houses do that. They settle and sigh and creak in ways that feel almost human. Arthur used to say the house talked to us. "Listen," he'd whisper, squeezing my hand. "She's reminding us she's still standing." I wondered if that was true of people too. The following week, I noticed my name was missing from the utility bill, then from the insurance statement, then from the property tax notice. Each time I asked gently, each time I was told not to worry. "You're safe, Mom. We've got you covered. You don't need to stress." Another word people use when they want you to stop asking questions. I stopped asking. Instead, I watched. I watched my daughter-in-law make notes while pretending to scroll on her phone. I watched my son sign documents without reading them. I watched how quickly people grow comfortable when they think no one is paying attention. One afternoon, while cleaning out a closet that hadn't been opened in years, I found Arthur's old filing cabinet. It was heavy, scratched, and stubborn. The bottom drawer stuck unless you lifted it just right. I remembered that. Inside were folders labeled in Arthur's careful handwriting: warranties, receipts, old contracts. And at the very back, a slim leather folder I didn't recognize. It wasn't locked. Arthur had never been secretive with me. He had simply been thorough. Inside were documents dated years before his death, amendments, trust language. Notes in the margins, written in pencil. I sat on the floor for a long time, reading slowly. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I felt something colder, steadier, understanding. Arthur had anticipated this, not the exact people. Not the exact methods, but the possibility. There were clauses, conditions, safeguards, and there was a letter. My name was written on the envelope in the same handwriting he used to leave grocery lists on the counter. "Margaret," it began. "I won't tell you everything he wrote. Some things belong to the living alone. But there was one line I read over and over. If they ever decide you are no longer necessary, remember this: silence gives you time, time gives you clarity. And clarity gives you power." I folded the letter and placed it back where I found it. That evening, I made dinner as usual: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. No one noticed anything different. That was the moment I stopped being invisible. That was the moment I chose to wait. Waiting is an underestimated skill. People think waiting means doing nothing, sitting still, letting time pass, but real waiting is active. It requires attention. It requires restraint. It requires the discipline not to reveal what you know before it can protect you. After I found Arthur's letter, I changed nothing on the surface. I still drank my coffee at the same kitchen table. I still folded laundry on Tuesdays. I still asked my grandson about his homework and listened carefully even when he didn't look up from his phone. If anything, I became easier to ignore, and that was useful. I began to notice patterns. My daughter-in-law handled the mail every afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock. She sat at the desk near the window, the one Arthur had built himself, and opened envelopes with a silver letter opener I had received as a retirement gift. She never asked any more if she could help. She simply did. My son came home later and later. When he did, he was distracted, absorbed in conversations that stopped when I entered the room. His phone buzzed constantly. He stepped outside to answer it. I remembered when he used to come home and tell me everything. That memory didn't make me sad, it made me observant. One morning, I drove to the library. I told no one where I was going. No one asked. The library had been renovated recently. Bright windows, comfortable chairs, a quiet hum of printers and pages turning. I sat at a computer and logged into my email. Several messages had been archived without my knowledge. Bank notifications, policy updates, appointment reminders. None of them required passwords I didn't have. They required only attention. I printed everything. The librarian smiled at me when I finished. "Need a folder?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "something sturdy." At home, I placed the papers in a plain manila folder and hid it in the back of my closet, behind winter coats that hadn't been worn in years. That folder became my anchor. Over the next weeks, I made small, reasonable phone calls. Not dramatic ones, not accusatory ones, just clarifying ones. "I'm calling to confirm my status on the account. I'd like to understand why my name isn't listed anymore. Could you explain this clause to me? People are surprisingly honest when you sound calm." At the bank, a young man explained that the account had been converted to an administrative structure. "At whose request?" I asked. There was a pause. "At your son's," he said. I thanked him. At the insurance company, a woman explained that the policyholder had been changed. "Is that allowed without my signature?" I asked. Another pause. "No," she said carefully. "It isn't." I thanked her too. At no point did I raise my voice. At no point did I threaten. I simply listened. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law knocked on my bedroom door. She never knocked before. "We're thinking of having the house evaluated," she said, "just to know where we stand." I smiled. "Of course," she lingered. "You don't mind, do you?" "No," I said. "Why would I?" She studied my face as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. That night, I called Margaret. We hadn't spoken in years, not because of distance, but because life has a way of moving people into different rooms. When I told her my name, she laughed softly. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. Margaret had been an estate attorney for 3 decades before retiring. She knew Arthur well. They'd worked together once long ago when he helped her rewire an old house she had bought. "I found something," I said. "Of course you did," she replied. I drove to her house the next morning. It smelled like lemon polish and old books. We sat at her dining table, the documents spread between us. She didn't interrupt while I explained. She read everything twice. When she finally looked up, her expression was calm. "They assumed you wouldn't notice," she said. "That was their first mistake." "What's the second?" I asked. "They assumed you wouldn't understand," she said. "Arthur planned better than that." She explained what the clauses meant, how the trust was designed, what could be challenged and what could not. "They're exposed," she said finally, "but only if you proceed carefully." "I intend to," I said. Margaret nodded. "Good, because if you confront them too soon, they'll panic, and panicked people destroy evidence." I drove home with the windows down. That evening, I noticed my son pacing in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes," he said quietly, "I know, we're almost there." He turned when he saw me and smiled too quickly. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Great," he said. "Just work, work." Another useful word. Days passed, then weeks. I continued to be agreeable, cooperative, unconcerned. I signed what I was asked to sign only after reading everything slowly and asking for copies. I asked questions that sounded naive but weren't. "Oh, what does this mean? Is this standard? Have we always done it this way?" Each question left a trail. Meanwhile, Margaret introduced me to someone else, Daniel, a financial auditor who specialized in untangling family misunderstandings. Daniel was precise. He didn't speculate, he documented. "This isn't malicious," he said after reviewing everything. "It's opportunistic." "What's the difference?" I asked. "In court," he said, "everything." By the time summer arrived, I had 3 folders. One for banking, one for property, one for correspondence. I kept them separate, organized, quiet. The tension in the house thickened. My daughter-in-law began locking her office door. My son avoided eye contact. They whispered more, laughed less. One night I heard them arguing after midnight. You said she wouldn't notice. She's old, not blind. We need to move faster, faster. That was the first time fear crept into their voices. And fear, once introduced, is difficult to control. A letter arrived the following week, a formal notice, polite, professional. They wanted me to sign over occupancy rights for my own protection. I read it twice. Then I placed it in the folder. That evening I made tea and sat at the table while they discussed logistics as if I weren't there. When my son finally looked at me, I met his gaze calmly. "May I ask something?" I said. "Of course," he replied too quickly. "Why now?" He hesitated, "just long enough." "That's what I thought," I said softly. Silence filled the room. It wasn't anger that frightened them, it was my certainty. That night I wrote a list. Not of grievances, of steps, and at the top I wrote Arthur's words again just to remind myself. Silence gives you time. I slept deeply. By the time autumn arrived, the house no longer felt like mine. It wasn't hostility that made it so, it was efficiency. Rooms were repurposed without discussion, furniture rearranged. Boxes stacked in corners as if preparing for a move no one had officially announced. I was still welcome. I was simply no longer central. This is how displacement happens, not with force but with momentum. I continued my routines. Morning walks, library visits, tea at 4 o'clock. Outwardly, I was unchanged. Internally, I was ready. Margaret called one afternoon and asked if I was sitting down. "They've scheduled a review," she said, formal. "Legal? I assumed they would," I replied. "They think it's procedural," she continued. "They believe they're finalizing things." I smiled. Good. The meeting was set for the first Thursday in October, a neutral location. A conference room at the law firm that had once handled Arthur's business contracts. I recognized the name on the letterhead. That mattered. In the days leading up to the meeting, my son grew restless. He hovered when I packed my purse. Asked where I was going, offered rides I declined. "You don't have to come, Mom," he said the night before. "We can handle this." "I know," I said, "but I'd like to listen." He nodded slowly. Listening had become threatening. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. Not elegantly, not dramatically, respectably. The conference room was bright and overly clean. A long table, bottled water, legal pads aligned perfectly. My son and daughter-in-law sat together on one side. Their attorney sat beside them, confident, relaxed. Margaret sat with me on the other side. Daniel joined us a moment later, nodding politely. Introductions were made. Then the attorney began. He spoke of restructuring, of guardianship, of best interests. He spoke as if I were absent. I let him finish. When he finally looked at me and asked if I had any questions, I did not speak immediately. I reached into my bag and removed a folder, just one. I slid it across the table. "This," I said, "belongs here." The attorney frowned slightly and opened it. Silence followed. He turned a page, then another. His expression shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. "This changes things," he said. My son leaned forward. "What does?" The attorney did not answer him. Instead, he looked at Margaret. "These documents were valid?" he asked. "They are," she replied, "and properly executed." The room seemed to shrink. Daniel spoke next, his voice calm and precise. "There are also discrepancies in the banking records," he said. "Transfers made without authorization." My daughter-in-law straightened in her chair. "That's not," the attorney raised a hand gently. "Let's take a moment," he said. I watched my son carefully. This was the first time he looked frightened. Not angry, not defensive, afraid. The attorney cleared his throat. "It appears," he said slowly, "that certain actions were taken under assumptions that are unsupported." No one spoke. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply waited. The meeting ended quietly. No decisions made, no signatures exchanged, just uncertainty. That afternoon, the house was silent. My daughter-in-law retreated to her office and closed the door. My son paced. At dinner, no one spoke. The next day, letters arrived, then phone calls, then delays. Everything slowed. Margaret advised patience. "They're recalibrating," she said. "They know now." The weeks that followed were uncomfortable but illuminating. Documents were returned, accounts corrected. My name reappeared where it belonged. Apologies were not offered. They weren't needed. One evening, my son sat across from me at the kitchen table. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "I know," I replied. He looked up sharply. "You do?" "Yes," I said. "You meant for it to be easy." He said nothing. The house felt different then, not restored but realigned. I began looking for a place of my own, not in anger, in clarity. Margaret helped me find a small apartment near the park. One bedroom, big windows, quiet neighbors. On moving day, my daughter-in-law supervised efficiently. My son hugged me awkwardly. "Call if you need anything," he said. I smiled. "I always do." The first night in my new home, I slept with the windows open. The air was cool, honest. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Mornings at the cafe, afternoons reading, evenings walking. The phone rang less often, that was fine. One afternoon, Margaret called with an update. They've withdrawn their petition, she said, formally. Good, I replied. And Margaret, I added. Yes, thank you, she laughed softly. Arthur would be proud. I hung up and sat quietly for a long time. For the first time in months, there was nothing pending, nothing unresolved, just life. People assume that when conflict ends, there is a moment that feels like victory, a realization, a rush, a sense of triumph. That wasn't my experience. What followed was quieter than that, slower, more human. In the weeks after everything settled, I found myself noticing small things I hadn't paid attention to in years: the sound of birds in the morning, the way sunlight moved across the floor as the day passed, the comfort of choosing when to speak and when not to. Freedom, I learned, often feels like ordinary peace. My new apartment was modest, but it was mine. No shared schedules. No conversations overheard. No decisions made around me without my knowledge. I arranged the furniture myself. I placed Arthur's photograph on the bookshelf near the window where the light was softest. I didn't speak to him out loud. I didn't need to. We had already said what mattered. Sometimes my son called. The conversations were polite, careful. He told me about work, about my grandson's school, about ordinary things. He never mentioned the meeting. I never asked. There are truths that don't need to be repeated to remain understood. My daughter-in-law called once. She asked if I was settling in. She offered help. Her voice was different than before, less certain, more measured. I'm doing well, I said honestly. That was enough. As autumn turned to winter, I developed routines that belonged entirely to me. Tuesdays were for the library, Thursdays for the market, Sundays for long walks when the weather allowed. At the cafe near the park, the barista learned my order. We spoke about books, about the weather, about nothing of consequence. It felt wonderful. One afternoon, while sorting through a box I hadn't unpacked yet, I found Arthur's leather folder again. The same one that had started everything. I opened it slowly. This time, I wasn't looking for protection or proof. I was looking for closure. I reread his letter once more, then returned it to the folder. I didn't need to keep it close anymore. The power it gave me had already done its work. I donated most of Arthur's papers to the Historical Society. He had been proud of his business, and they were glad to have the records. It felt right. Letting go felt right. People often say aging is about losing things. They're wrong. Aging is about refining. You lose the need to explain yourself. You lose the habit of tolerating disrespect. You lose the fear of being misunderstood. What you gain is perspective. I no longer wondered whether I had done the right thing. I knew I had, not because I won, but because I remained myself. Months later, I attended my grandson's school event. I sat in the audience beside other grandparents. We smiled politely, shared programs, whispered when necessary. When he spotted me, he waved. I waved back. Nothing about that moment was dramatic, and yet it meant everything. Afterward, my son walked with me to my car. You seem happy, he said. I am, I replied. He hesitated. I wish I'd handled things differently. I considered him for a moment. I know, I said. So do I, he nodded. That was all. On my 75th birthday, I woke early and made myself tea. I sat by the window and watched the city come to life. I didn't feel old. I felt complete. There was no bitterness in me, no desire to revisit what had happened. The story had ended where it needed to end, with clarity, with dignity, with peace. And if there is one thing I have learned in my 75 years, it is this: you don't need to be loud to be heard. You don't need to fight to stand your ground. And you don't lose your worth just because someone decides to look past you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm, pay attention, and choose your moment. That is not weakness, that is wisdom.